Private Kenneth Shadrick crouched in a ditch north of Osan with a 2.36-inch bazooka across his knees and watched a Soviet-made T-34 tank roll toward his position. The date was July 5, 1950. The location was South Korea. The tank weighed 32 tons and mounted an 85mm main gun. Shadrick's bazooka weighed 13.3 pounds and fired a rocket that had worked perfectly against German tanks 5 years earlier in Europe. He fired from 15 yards. The rocket hit the rear armor of the T-34, the weakest point, the most vulnerable angle, the shot every bazooka team trained for. The rocket bounced off. He fired again. It bounced off. He kept firing. 22 rockets total were fired at that tank and the tanks behind it from distances close enough to see the crew inside. Every single rocket either bounced off or detonated harmlessly against armor the 2.36-inch warhead could not penetrate. One soldier later described what it felt like to watch this happen. The tank, he said, suddenly looked as big as a battleship. Kenneth Shadrick became the first American soldier killed in the Korean War. He died because the weapon the army had given him did not work. Not because he used it wrong, not because he lacked courage. Because the rocket-propelled grenade he fired at a T-34 tank from 15 yards could not penetrate the armor it hit. This is the story of Task Force Smith, of 540 men sent to stop the North Korean invasion with World War II weapons that had not been upgraded, maintained, or tested against the Soviet armor they were about to face. Of a bazooka that worked in 1944 and failed in 1950, and of what happens when men are ordered to hold a position with equipment that cannot do what they have been told it can do. The 2.36-inch bazooka was not a bad weapon. It was the wrong weapon. Development began in 1942 at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The official designation was rocket launcher, M1A1, but soldiers called it the bazooka after a musical instrument a comedian named Bob Burns played on the radio. The name stuck because the weapon looked like Burns's contraption, a 5-foot steel tube that you rested on your shoulder and fired rockets out of. The concept was simple. A shaped charge warhead would detonate on impact, focusing explosive force into a jet of superheated metal that could punch through armor. The rocket motor gave it range. The smoothbore tube gave it portability. 2 men could carry and operate it, 1 to aim and fire, 1 to load and watch for backblast. In Europe, the 2.36-inch bazooka worked. German tanks from 1942 through 1944 had armor the bazooka could defeat. The Panzer IV had frontal armor of 80mm. The bazooka could penetrate roughly 3 to 4 inches of armor plate under ideal conditions. That was enough. American infantry had a man-portable weapon that could kill tanks. Tank destroyers and artillery handled the heavier German armor. The bazooka handled everything else. By the time Germany surrendered in May of 1945, American forces had fired tens of thousands of bazooka rounds in combat. The weapon had proven itself. Therefore, when the army demobilized after the war and began the drawdown to peacetime manning and peacetime budgets, the bazooka stayed in the inventory. It worked, it was cheap, it was simple, it was good enough. But the tank it had been designed to fight was not the tank it was about to face. The Soviet T-34 tank entered production in 1940 and became the most produced tank of World War II. Total production exceeded 84,000 vehicles. The T-34-85 variant, introduced in early 1944, mounted an 85mm main gun and had frontal armor of 90mm sloped at 60 degrees. The sloping was critical. Sloped armor effectively doubled the thickness a penetrator had to punch through. The 2.36-inch bazooka could not reliably penetrate the frontal armor of a T-34-85 under any conditions. It could sometimes penetrate the side armor at optimal angles. It could rarely penetrate the rear armor if the hit was perpendicular and the range was close. But these were not guarantees, they were possibilities. And possibilities are not what you want when a 32-ton tank is rolling toward your position and you are holding the only anti-tank weapon your platoon has. The army knew this. Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks had been encountered by American-backed Chinese nationalist forces during the Chinese Civil War in the late 1940s. Reports existed. The data was available. The institutional knowledge was there. Therefore, the army developed a 3.5-inch bazooka with a larger warhead and greater penetration. Development was completed. The weapon existed, but it had not been issued to infantry units in Japan when the Korean War began. The units occupying Japan in the summer of 1950 were equipped with war surplus stocks of 2.36-inch bazookas left over from World War II. The 3.5-inch bazooka was in the inventory. It was not in the hands of the men who were about to need it. Task Force Smith was named after Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bradford Smith, commander of 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry Regiment, 24th Infantry Division. The division was stationed in Japan on occupation duty when North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950. The invasion caught American leadership by surprise. The North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel with 90,000 men, 150 T-34 tanks, and the clear objective of conquering the entire peninsula before the United States could respond. South Korean forces retreated. The South Korean military had no tanks, no anti-tank weapons, and no answer for the armored columns rolling south. President Truman authorized General Douglas MacArthur to commit American ground forces. MacArthur ordered the 24th Infantry Division into Korea immediately. The division was understrength, undertrained, and equipped with World War II weapons. Average infantry company strength was around 134 men instead of the authorized 205. Many soldiers were recent recruits with minimal training. The division had not conducted combined arms training or large-scale maneuvers in years. Occupation duty in Japan did not require it. Smith received his orders on July 1, 1950, take a reinforced infantry battalion to Korea, delay the North Korean advance, buy time for additional forces to arrive. He had roughly 48 hours to prepare. His task force consisted of about 540 men, 2 understrength rifle companies, half of a headquarters company, and attachments. They had 6 05mm recoilless rifles. They had 4.2-inch mortars. They had 2.36-inch bazookas. They had no armor. They had no tanks. They had no air support dedicated to their mission. They had ammunition for approximately 1 engagement. The task force flew into Korea on July 1st and 2nd. By July 4th, they were digging defensive positions on 2 hills north of Osan, astride the main invasion route from Seoul. The position overlooked the road. The fields of fire were good. The terrain was defensible. If the North Korean advance came down that road, Task Force Smith would see it coming. The rain started on July 4th and did not stop. The men dug foxholes in mud. They strung communication wire in the rain. They positioned the recoilless rifles on the high ground. They test-fired weapons to ensure they functioned. The bazooka teams checked their rockets. Everything worked. Everyone was cold, wet, and waiting. Smith's orders were clear: delay the enemy advance. How long he was expected to delay it was not specified. What he was supposed to do when his ammunition ran out was not specified. The assumption was that he would slow the North Koreans long enough for reinforcements to arrive, then withdraw. No one told him what to do if the North Koreans did not slow down. The North Korean column appeared at 8 in the morning on July 5th. 8 T-34 tanks in the lead, more behind them, infantry following. They were moving south on the main road in a formation that suggested they did not expect resistance. The task force held fire. Smith's order was to let the tanks pass and engage the infantry. The reasoning was sound. His position was not equipped to stop armor. His mission was to delay the infantry advance, let the tanks go, kill the infantry, deny the North Koreans the ground. But the bazooka teams had a different idea. They had anti-tank weapons. There were tanks. The math was simple. The 1st bazooka team opened fire at the lead tank from a range estimated between 15 and 20 yards. The rocket hit. The tank kept moving. A second rocket hit. The tank kept moving. The bazooka team fired again and again. Other teams joined in. Rockets hit the tanks from multiple angles. Side shots, rear shots. The closest thing to ideal engagement conditions a bazooka team could ask for. None of the rockets penetrated. Some bounced off without detonating. Some detonated against the armor and left scorch marks, but no penetration. The tankers inside buttoned up and kept moving. 22 rockets were fired in total at the lead tanks. Not one achieved a kill. The recoilless rifles had better luck. The 75mm recoilless rifle teams engaged the tanks and achieved some hits that damaged tracks and optics. But they could not penetrate the armor either. And the recoilless rifle was a large, conspicuous weapon with a massive backblast signature. Once it fired, every tank crew knew where it was. The recoilless rifle positions took return fire almost immediately. The T-34s rolled through the task force's position. They did not stop. They did not dismount infantry to clear the hills. They kept driving south. 8 tanks passed through without stopping. The infantry column behind them was a different problem. Smith gave the order to engage when the infantry column entered range. Mortars and small arms opened fire. The column took casualties and went to ground. For a brief window, it looked like the plan might work. The infantry was stopped. The position was holding. Artillery support was on call. If they could hold the infantry here and treat them with fire support, the mission was achievable. But the artillery support did not arrive as expected. Communication problems and coordination failures delayed the fire missions. When artillery finally came in, it was insufficient to break the North Korean infantry, and the task force's own ammunition was running low. By early afternoon, North Korean forces had flanked the position. More tanks had come down the road. The task force was taking fire from 3 sides. Ammunition was critically low. Casualties were mounting. The radio was barely functional. Smith gave the order to withdraw. The withdrawal became a rout. North Korean infantry fired on the retreating Americans. Men were hit in the open. Wounded were left behind. Equipment was abandoned. The task force broke contact and moved south in small groups, many of them separated from their units, trying to reach friendly lines that may or may not have existed. Kenneth Shadrick died during the engagement. Reports differ on the exact circumstances. Some accounts say he was killed by tank fire while engaging a T-34. Some say small arms fire. The official casualty report lists him as killed in action on July 5, 1950, near Osan. He was 19 years old. He was from Skin Fork, West Virginia. He had been in Korea for less than a week. Task Force Smith suffered approximately 150 casualties. The numbers are imprecise because the unit fragmented during the withdrawal and accurate accountability took days. Roughly 20 killed, 130 wounded or missing. The task force delayed the North Korean advance by approximately 7 hours. 7 hours purchased at the cost of 150 men and the destruction of an infantry battalion as a cohesive fighting unit. The men who survived Task Force Smith came out of the fight with specific knowledge. The knowledge that the 2.36-inch bazooka could not kill a T-34 tank. The knowledge that their leadership had sent them into an engagement with inadequate weapons. The knowledge that courage and training and tactical positioning mean nothing if the equipment you are issued cannot perform the mission you are assigned. One soldier's description of watching the bazooka rounds bounce off became the most repeated quote from the battle. It suddenly looked as big as a battleship. He was describing the moment of realization, the moment when the weapon failed and the tank kept coming and there was nothing else to do. That moment repeated itself across the Korean peninsula in the opening weeks of the war. American units equipped with 2.36-inch bazookas engaged North Korean armor and watched their rockets fail. Men died in those engagements. Positions were overrun. The North Korean advance continued. The institutional response was rapid. The 3.5-inch bazooka, already developed, was rushed into production and shipped to Korea. The first 3.5-inch bazookas arrived in theater in late July, 3 weeks after Task Force Smith. The weapon worked. It could penetrate the armor of a T-34 at combat ranges. Infantry finally had an anti-tank weapon that could do what they needed it to do. But the 3 weeks between Task Force Smith and the arrival of the 3.5-inch bazooka were 3 weeks when American infantry faced Soviet-made armor with a weapon that could not stop it. Men fought in those 3 weeks. Men died in those 3 weeks. The casualty reports from early July 1950 document exactly what happens when you send soldiers into combat with equipment that does not work. The 2.36-inch bazooka was not used again in Korea after the 3.5-inch variant became available. It remained in inventory for training purposes and for rear echelon security, but frontline infantry units discarded it as soon as the replacement arrived. The weapon that had worked in Europe in 1944 was obsolete by 1950. The army knew it. The soldiers knew it. The North Koreans knew it. Kenneth Shadrick's death was not meaningless. No combat death is meaningless. But his death was preventable. If the 3.5-inch bazooka had been issued to Task Force Smith, if the institutional inertia of peacetime supply systems had moved faster, if someone in the chain of command had prioritized the fielding of weapons that could actually defeat the threat they were facing, Shadrach might have lived. He might have fired a rocket that penetrated. He might have killed the tank. He might have survived the engagement and gone home after his tour. None of that happened because the weapon he was issued could not do the job he was ordered to do. Task Force Smith is remembered as the first American ground engagement of the Korean War. It is remembered as a delaying action that bought time for reinforcements. It is remembered as an example of courage under impossible conditions, but it should also be remembered as a failure of institutional readiness. The men of Task Force Smith were brave. They were well trained for the mission they thought they were going to execute. They were sent into combat with World War II equipment against an enemy equipped with weapons designed after World War II ended. The bazooka worked in the last war. It did not work in this war, and men died because of that gap. The 2.36-inch bazooka weighs 13.3 pounds. It fires a rocket with a shaped charge warhead designed to penetrate 3 to 4 inches of armor plate. In Europe in 1944, that was enough. In Korea in 1950, against a T-34 tank with sloped frontal armor and experienced crews, it was not. 22 rockets fired from 15 yards. Every single one bounced off. The tank suddenly looked as big as a battleship, and the men holding the bazookas had nothing else. If you are a Korean War veteran or you know someone who served, leave a comment below. These stories need to be preserved. The next generation needs to understand what happened when the weapons failed and the men kept fighting anyway. This is the story of the 2.36-inch bazooka in Korea. A weapon that worked perfectly until it didn't. A weapon that soldiers trusted because it had proven itself in the previous war. A weapon that failed when they needed it most. And the men who fired it anyway, from 15 yards, watching the rockets bounce off, knowing that the tank was not going to stop and that they had no answer for it, except to fire again and hope the next one worked. The next one did not work. None of them worked. The men died because the institution sent them to fight a tank with a weapon that could not kill it. Kenneth Shadrach was the first. He was not the last. But when the 3.5-inch bazooka finally arrived and American infantry could fight Soviet armor on even terms, the dying slowed. Not because the men were braver, not because the tactics were better, because the weapon worked. That is the lesson of Task Force Smith. Equipment matters. Readiness matters. Institutional decisions about what weapons to field and when to field them have consequences measured in lives. The 2.36-inch bazooka was a good weapon for the war it was designed to fight. It was the wrong weapon for the war it was asked to fight, and the men who carried it paid the price.